Hi, and welcome to my Northeastern web development midterm video. So far in web development, we've been really learning about the basics of web development so that we can, kind of really build a good foundation in full stack web development. So I was trying to think, what mental maps were helpful for me in terms of organizing the concepts we've came over so far. And for me, I really broke it down into the two architecture types that we've worked with so far. So far, we've looked at two different, kind of infrastructure types. The first one that I'll focus on that'll also really kind of help us take a look at the basics of the tools needed, which will be used across both of these frameworks. So the first framework is a two-tier framework. Now, those two tiers are basically the client, which is the browser, and the server, which for our class's case has been the HTTP server. And for this framework, the mental model I was using was that of a house. So what do I mean by that? So, for a house, you kind of have the baseline structure, your brick foundation, 4 walls, etc. For us, that really is HTML. HTML helps really provide the structure, the base structure for the content that we're providing to our web page. Then, you kind of want to start customizing things. You don't just want an empty house. So things like maybe a custom paint job or, antique special pieces are really things that you would kind of decide yourself as the owner or resident of the home. And for us, that is the CSS. CSS is really the framework that controls how things appear and allows you to be very specific using things like selectors of various specificity levels to be able to control how your page looks. But now we want to be able to kind of have lights and other appliances. And since these are pretty standard, we can order these, from Costco. This is kind of the equivalent of Bootstrap. So Bootstrap itself is a framework that kind of works a little bit with, some of these other tools that we're going to be talking with in terms of being able to give you predefined functionality that's common. So things like buttons or cards or drop-down menus, so that they look consistent across your applications, and you're also not spending a lot of time developing a complex CSS file for something that's kind of already wildly available. But now that you have all these appliances, how do you control them? So really, you have your smart home operating system that connects everything. For WebDev, that is JavaScript. So JavaScript or ECMAScript 6+, which is technically the version that we're using for this class, and JavaScript is just an implementation. But it is really what enables this interactivity for In terms of the client server piece, the client is really like your homeowner, right? They're the ones who are, say, flipping the light switch on, or, turning off the stove, that kind of thing. They're the ones that are making the requests. And then the server, it's not a perfect analogy, but think of it almost kind of like the Wi-Fi, the thing that connects all the smart devices together to enable those commands, like the JavaScript ones that we talked about before. So now I want to move on and talk about the second framework that we're using. And to be clear, these base pieces, HTML, CSS, Bootstrap, and JavaScript, don't go away in this infrastructure type, but I'll mostly just be focusing on, kind of the unique parts that we learned about during this other infrastructure type, which is a 3-tier system. The 3 tiers being the client, server, database. In this example, the client is really, your Amazon.com website. And specifically thinking about the GUI where the customer interacts. The server, we kind of think of as the back-end services, broadly speaking, and I'll dig into more detail on what that means in a moment. Database, we're really thinking of that as really kind of the warehouse with all the goods at a very, kind of broad level as to what these different 3 tiers are. But then in terms of diving into the concepts that are different with this 3-tier system, I'll get into that now. So say you're a customer and I want to buy Northeastern swag. Not sure if that's on Amazon, but for today it is. I am going to put in that request through my browser to add to cart. This action is basically a front-end request. And just to double back, so with the server, specifically the server that we're using is Node Express, which is part of what I'll get into back here as we're fleshing out this example. So we've made this front-end request. The online store needs to request that shipment is made to me. This is done on the WebDev side as an express route, kind of a request that is made to the warehouse. And so the warehouse itself is the stuff that has all of the Northeastern swag, and it needs to be able to receive the signal that it's needed, and then also to be able to deliver it out, to be able to return it eventually to the customer. So in our class, the database that we've been using for this is MongoDB, which is a document-based database. So once that's been scheduled, your website will let you know your estimated time of delivery and status updates from the warehouse. Basically, info sent back via a route, but the actual update itself is done on the front end. Basically, the front end is just responding to the new data that it receives and then updates itself, in our case using JavaScript. Bit of what I talked about in that whiteboard session, and now I really kind of want to talk about how these pieces start to interact together to give a more detailed overview of what we've learned so far. So I kind of want to start kind of from the ground up and then kind of build from there in terms of how they interact. After we kind of get through the basics on this slide, I'll talk a little bit also about the infrastructure models and how those interact with different pieces as well. So like we said before, HTML really provides the structure through things like elements. The general tag format is shown here. These are a few of the element types that we've worked with this semester. Forms to be able to submit data, links either to other pages or to external sites, headers, footers, scripts, which is important because that ultimately will be how one way that we tie in our JavaScript scripts is through the scripts tag. And there's kind of ways to specify these elements. So say for instance, if I wanted to do attribute equals something, and some of those attributes being an ID, you typically only want to have one thing have a given ID, so you don't want to be giving really a bunch of stuff the same ID. Classes, so this is kind of more appropriate if you think you're going to have multiple things. So for example, if I want to have all the buttons act the same way, then I could make a class that kind of groups all of those together. And then the source, so that comes up in things like links, where you're saying, where is the route to this thing that we're looking for. It could also be links, again, to external things. So we'll talk about it in Bootstrap, but basically the link to Bootstrap is as a link to a website where that content is being served. So now that we have kind of this base structure, ways to indicate what's the title, what's the metadata, or meta information about the page, what's the title of the page, those kind of details. Now is when we really start to think about, all right, how do I want to present the information that's here? How do I want it to look? And so a piece of that is the box model, which of course interacts very closely with HTML because the box model kind of controls placement of items, as well as things like how much padding there is, where the boundary is, how two elements next to each other are going to interact, those kinds of things. The way that you kind of indicate what attributes you want to change, so attributes are kind of the things that are inside the CSS. So you'd have something kind of like, attribute value, which I see is down here. So attributes are things like, width, background color, the list goes on that front. There's a couple ways that you can select things. By ID, which is kind of that super specific level, by class with a dot, by type, which doesn't require anything in front of it. And this also kind of goes in increasing or decreasing levels of priority. So, an ID selector will supersede a class selector or a type selector, etc. So that is one form of specificity. The other kind is whether or not you have inline CSS. So yes, technically you can have inline CSS in your HTML. A lot of times, though, we find it's helpful to really separate that out into its own page. But if you do have some stuff that's inline and some stuff that's in a separate page, the inline stuff is going to override. And then cascade is kind of if you have multiple things at the same level. So say two classes, what happens if an item happens to be both of those classes? It depends on which one of those classes was specified in your CSS document first. So now we kind of see how HTML and CSS interact with each other. Now we want to get into Bootstrap. So Bootstrap is kind of a blend of an HTML and CSS framework that enables you to have certain pre-styled components so that you're not having to do, bespoke CSS to kind of really define how something looks. It's also useful if you want, several reusable type things. So say several buttons, several cards, which is one of these components, a consistent nav bar. So again, ways to either do a drop down or navigate between different pages. And this is served by a content server. And so you include that as a link into your HTML. This you can still specify, of course. There's certain things that you could then, if you really want to customize how it looks in the kind of Bootstrap standard way, you can still use CSS to further customize. So now getting over to JavaScript or ECMAScript 6, which is kind of the standard that we're using. And so ECMAScript, I'll also put in a note that we use modules here, is the standard. But JavaScript being, really kind of the asynchronous programming language that enables our websites to be interactive. It enables it so that if I want to, click on the nav bar that we've created here, it will pick up that click and, change to the new website. Or, even more custom, say I have a button, which I'll dive into in the coding example later. I click the button and I want something to happen. Well, this JavaScript is what is going to be able to make it happen. So a lot of times that's by writing functions, because basically once an action is registered, we are going to kind of trigger a function to run. And that can look like a lot of different things. One of the tools that could be used is like a for loop, which kind of has its different syntax than, say, what you would see in, kind of a Java or Python. And then, variable types that are seen as in JavaScript. I'm going to dive into JavaScript a little bit more in detail, particularly around the asynchronous element when I go into the deep dive. So for now, I want to talk a little bit about a feature that's not on here, which is called the DOM. So the DOM kind of belongs to both the CSS and JavaScript in terms of a framework for thinking about the document. This is part of what enables us to access the content that's currently on the document. So in that way, also kind of relates to CSS or to HTML. And then for JavaScript to be able to update it to either change the way something looks or add more content to the front end. And so this was really helpful when earlier in the class for my personal website, I wanted to make it so that I could pull the experiences from a JSON so that it'd be easier for me to just add my experiences to the JSON than to try and manually hard code it each time. And so we were able to use the DOM to update the front end via JavaScript. And then lastly, on this basic slide, just talking about the MDN, which is the Mozilla Developers Network. And this is really a great resource for a lot of different topics in WebDev, and can link you out to other resources as well. A bit about the infrastructure models, so that we can talk about the two main servers that we use so far, kind of the main differences, and how they tie back into some of the concepts we just talked about on the other side. So in this two-tier system, we have the client, which is kind of our front-end web page, and the server that we're running is an HTTP server that we're using Node to kind of serve up. And so HTTP server, and Node specifically, allows you to run ECMAScript 6+ or JavaScript in the server, and so it's able to kind of process these asynchronous requests that are coming in. So an asynchronous request we're going to dive into again a little bit more later, but you recognize this as kind of one of the function types from JavaScript that we were talking about before. And then a lot of times this is returning either a value, information, maybe it's returning something that's then going to go and update the DOM on the client side, that kind of stuff. For our 3-tier, where we have the client, the server, and the database, of note, the client is mostly just interacting with the server, either posting, so requesting information, putting new information to the server. So say if I've typed in something to a form, I've hit submit, and I want that information to eventually make it into my database, I'm going to post it to the server. The server is then going to have some type of database action that's associated with a JavaScript function that we've written to request this information be added to the database. If needed, the database will return. In the case of just updating something, maybe it doesn't return anything. And then, on the other side, if you want to get the information from the database, say it's first loading and it's like, hey, what's in the database? Because I want to be able to show what's in the database on my client page, you would get a GET request. This could also trigger a database action to return the info so that it can get sent to the client. And this server framework is, again, it's run by Node, but it is the Express framework, which is a popular framework for Node.js. But this allows you to use kind of these HTTP methods to kind of route things between the server, the client, and the server and the database, etc. For my deep dive, I want to talk a little bit more about interactivity and what that really means and kind of what drives that process for our websites. So, interactivity, when you think about it, is really that the user is able to do something on your web page and that triggers some type of response. It may not be a visual response. For example, if you're just submitting information to a database like we saw in our 3-tier model, then you may not actually see any change on the front end, but it's triggering the fact that it pushes that information to the server and the server pushes it to the database. But basically it's responding to the fact that you submit this information. That's what we're really talking about when we're talking about interactivity, is being able to respond to events like this. So I want to talk about 2 different events in terms of broad categories that we've worked with this semester so far. One is the form. So in our last project, we had users submit a form to indicate that they wanted to donate to a film fundraising platform. So, you type in your name, your email, the pledge amount, etc. You hit submit. That's it. That's kind of the end of the user-facing experience. But, that submission is a form action. What happens with that form action depends on what you specified in your HTML. So for form specifically, it's a tag type. So, basically you would have form, info inside here. One of the attributes is an action. So by default, if you leave the action blank, it is going to append it to the URL. So say with this Google Docs website, if there was a form, it would just go in here and say, start tagging in stuff at the end here, which is not the most useful, maybe for debugging or something like that when you're first developing the website. But ultimately, you want that data to go somewhere. And so that's really where you need to route it somewhere. So this could be routing to another page. So for example, if you want, once you submit to change to another page, you could, send it to that. You could also kind of create a JavaScript function to kind of really dictate where it goes. Or, with your 3-tier system, you could kind of trigger a post request with the information from the form in it and send that to the server, which again will then send it to the database depending on what the action is. So that's one kind of action. Another event type we're going to look at is, say, if we're clicking a button, and this is going to be an example that I'm going to go into in the coding example. But basically, if the user clicks a button, that click is an action type, but, who's listening to that click when it happens? Well, you need to have an action listener on that button to be able to let the JavaScript hear that click. So in JavaScript, you would have that button, add action listener, and then your action type would be click. So that allows JavaScript to kind of hear that that click has happened. That click then triggers a function, the function that you specified in your JavaScript file. And that is what is able to have it respond to your initial button click. I'm going to walk into an example of how this, trigger function could then potentially also work with, say, like a CSS file to change the appearance of something else back in the front end. deep dive, I wanted to talk about asynchronous workflows, since this is also kind of really important for the web page being responsive. Although in this case, it's more kind of responsive to changes on the back end, but could apply for other things. But for this example, I'm going to look at what happens when a user loads their web page, kind of at the index HTML for the first time. So this is really similar to the example from when I made my personal website, right? The first time you open it, it needs to check, hey, does Margaret have any new work experiences? Where the work experience is stored in the JSON. So it is going to asynchronously check for content in the JSON. It's important that it's asynchronous because you don't want it to kind of get hung up on checking for this asynchronous content, particularly say if there's no content there. You want to be able to kind of go along with the rest of your setup or your other actions that are happening. So basically this async allows you to kind of control for once this comes back, return, if not, kind of keep going on everything else. That is done through JavaScript, which again is kind of linked to the HTML page that it's affecting via the script tag. And so that's really kind of how these all end up linked together. Once it checks for this content, it's going to kind of return a JSON form of the content that's in there. Now you need to be able to do something with it. In the case of my site, I took that content, split it out into individual cards per item, and then I wanted to be able to get those cards back into my front end, and that's kind of where the DOM came in. So there was another JavaScript file that basically took whatever was spit out from this JSON and then selected any existing elements. So if it's the first time, there may not be any. If it's loaded before, it could have kind of the existing cards. And then you're actually able to, excuse me, return out, kind of HTML and kind of append it out. And then using different functions to kind of update, push that new HTML into the front end. And this lets you kind of have an adaptive web page in that as you're adding more information on this back end, or thinking about the 3-tier system, if you're adding more information to the database, you're deleting data, you want it to stay up to date. It's really kind of this chain that allows what the front end is representing to stay up to date. Now I'm going to do a coding walkthrough to kind of show how that action listener sequence works, and really show kind of how it can interact with CSS as well, since we didn't get into that quite as much. So first of all, I need my index file. We're going to use HTML5, which is kind of the standard that we use here. We're just going to say that this is Margaret's coding demo. This already has some kind of default meta information. We're going to also add in the author is me. All right, and so now we want to get into the body, which is where we're ultimately going to want things happening. So I'm going to go ahead and give it a header. We're going to make it H1. We typically only want to have one level that's H1, and that's fine in this case. We're going to call this coding demo. Then I'm also going to make an H2 under here. Actually, before that, I want to put in a div just to kind of help clean things up and keep them separate. So first I'm going to wrap my H1 in this div. And I'm going to do another div, H2 this time, just so it's slightly smaller. Actually, you know what? Let's make it H3 just to make the difference a little bit more clear. We're going to call this change me. basically this is what we're ultimately going to want to have changed whenever we click our button. And I've decided I want to try and use Bootstrap just to make this a little bit easier. So I'm going to pull the script for Bootstrap, put that in the bottom of my body. And I'm going to look for buttons. Perfect. So we're going to make this just a basic Bootstrap button. And I'll put in a little comment. I'm just going to say press me. So this script is helping us get our Bootstrap functionality in, but we ultimately also want to be able to control for what happens when that button is clicked. And so for there, we put in another script, src equals, to fill this out in a second because it doesn't actually exist yet. But that's what we're going to make next. So first, I'm going to check and see what my site looks like. So pretty simple. Put our H1, our H3, and press. And so, of course, this is an HTTP server that we're running through Node to be able to test this. So moving on, I'm going to make a main.js file. This is a JavaScript file. And that's what we're going to be able to use to control our button. JS file. I want to go ahead and update this link as well as go back and fix something I forgot. So because we're using CS6+ as our standard, we need to say that this is a type equals module. Oops, I'm going to take that out. First, we need a way to kind of get the button out of our front end. And so that's kind of where the DOM comes into place. So button selected, we're going to use document, which is part of the DOM, dot query select, oops. And so since we're using a class, we would say dot button. We can say query select they're all. In this case, there's only one button, so it doesn't make a difference, but this would matter if there were, say, multiple buttons. This is reminding me that I need to wrap this in quotes here. Oops. So now this const button selected represents the actual physical button that we had over here in our HTML. So now that we have that button, we want to add an action listener. So button selected dot add action listener. So for that, I'm going to quickly reference back to my personal site web page just to double check on the syntax there. Got it. Add action listener. Add event listener, that's why it's incorrect. Alrighty. So fix that, add event listener. There we go. So let's click. And so this is kind of a shorthand way of saying this is the function I want to run, but then also I'm going to define that same function here inside of these brackets. So now that this is here, it means it's listening for the click, and when the click happens, it's going to do whatever function I put in here. So in this case, I just want to change the ID of that button. You'll see why in a second. That's kind of where we put the hook into CSS. So I'm going to say button selected dot class second. I'm going to go ahead and check my other example here. So it's in the issue is that I'm saying select all, but I really just want to select one because otherwise, yep, there we go. So the class list is individual to each individual item selected. So in this case, we're only selecting one, so there's only one class list to deal with. If we were looking at multiple, we would be using a for loop to iterate through all of the class lists of every single individual button. So we're going to say add. And then I'm going to say make the ID on state. Of course, this ID doesn't really correspond to anything yet. For it to mean anything, we need to have our CSS in. But for now, I'm just going to save, kind of confirm. Nothing's really changed here. So now we keep going. So the last file I'm going to make is style folder. And so for here, I just want to do hashtag on state because this is ultimately what is going to change with the button. So in this case, I want my background color to be aqua. So now when I go over to my web page, I press here, nothing happens. Well, it's because I haven't actually linked my style sheet back into this index sheet. It's kind of like, that's cool, what are you doing? Until we go through and put in the link to the style sheet. So I'm going to put this just above where my bootstrapped is. Oops. Now we're going to go into here. So I'm going to check back on my other example because I think I messed up the syntax here on how we linked in the CSS. Yes, all right, so this is my issue. In this case, I'm not showing it as a link. This is an href. There we go. Let's see if that fixes it. This is potentially another part of the problem. In here, what did I actually change? The button, but the button's also kind of getting governed by stuff in Bootstrap. So what I really want to do is go back to my main.js and actually change what it is that's getting turned on. So in this case, I don't really want the button to be selected. I want to select my H2 item. So I now need a new const text item equals document query selector H2, or sorry, H3. is ultimately what we want to select. And that item is what we want to get the class list from and add on state. Alright, so this is still not working, so now we're going to talk a little bit about troubleshooting. So now I've got to try and figure out what's happening here. So I'll start in the CSS. By using this hashtag, I'm saying that this is an ID. Okay, but over here, I'm saying add to the class list. So we could do a couple different things. We could change everything over to class, but since it really is an ID, it's a specific thing, what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave it as is in the CSS sheet and actually just change it here. So instead of saying let's add it to the class list, it's item.id. Alright, for now, I do this. Class list add on state. We're going to change it to this, which shows it's a state. Alright, let's see if we can get this working now. There we go. Now the background is happening. And then a little bit in terms of how you could keep expanding on this. So what happens if I keep pressing? Well, now it's already added the class here, so there's nothing else to change. Basically, if I want this to keep cycling through, I would need to add another function to clear the background and essentially remove that class tag of onState for this to flicker off. Otherwise, it's just going to permanently stay on in this state. Thank you.